Every 10 standard years, the galaxy watched its strongest warriors try to kill each other. They called it the Trials of Supremacy, and it was the oldest and most respected tradition in the galactic concord. 40 spacefaring species sent their finest champions to a massive orbital station called the Crucible, where they fought one-on-one in front of billions of spectators until only one was left standing. The winner earned more than glory. Their species received trade advantages, the political power, and a permanent seat on the High Tribunal for the next decade. Losing meant shame. Losing badly meant economic punishment and forced tribute to the stronger species. For as long as anyone could remember, 3 species had dominated the trials. The Vethrak were the most feared. They were towering reptilian predators, each one standing close to 9 feet tall, covered in thick armored scales, and blessed with 4 powerful arms that could tear apart metal plating. And they had won 6 of the last 10 cycles. The Draelith were second. They were insectoid warriors, with exoskeletons harder than ship armor, and reflexes so fast that some scientists believed they could see a fraction of a second into the future. They had claimed 3 victories. The Corvani, a cunning mammalian species with venomous claws and a pack-hunting instinct bred into their bones, had taken the remaining one. Nobody else came close. Nobody else was expected to. And certainly nobody expected anything from the newest species in the Concord, a strange, soft-skinned race from a deadly little planet called Earth. Humanity had only been part of the galactic community for 12 years. First contact had been an accident, a Concord survey ship stumbling across a human deep space probe and following its signal back to a world that made most aliens shudder. Earth was a death world by every standard measure. Its gravity was crushing compared to the galactic average. Its atmosphere was a toxic mix of oxygen and nitrogen that would burn the lungs of half the species in the Concord. Its weather ranged from scorching deserts to frozen wastelands, and its ecosystem was a never-ending war of teeth, claws, venom, and disease. Everything on Earth was built to kill everything else, and humans had somehow clawed their way to the top of the food chain and then into space. Most aliens thought of humans as a curiosity. Tough, sure. Dangerous in a bar fight, probably. But champions? Warriors worthy of the Crucible? The idea was laughable. That was why it sent shockwaves through the Concord when Laura Kim, the human ambassador, a calm woman with dark hair and steady eyes, who never raised her voice and never backed down from anything, walked into the registration hall and formally entered Earth into the Trials of Supremacy. The hall went quiet. A Vethrak official looked down at her from behind the registration desk and asked her to repeat herself. She did, with the same calm tone, and handed over the paperwork. The news spread across the galaxy within hours. Some species laughed openly. Others were uneasy in ways they could not quite explain. A few quietly adjusted their wagers, not because they believed the humans could win, but because Deathworlders were unpredictable, and unpredictable things made smart gamblers nervous. Earth's champion arrived at the Crucible aboard a small, unimpressive transport ship that looked like a toy next to the massive warships and luxury cruisers of the other delegations. His name was Danny Cole. He was 34 years old, a former Marine and mixed martial arts fighter from a small town in Ohio. He stood just under 6 feet tall, lean and scarred, with hands that were rough from years of hard use and eyes that were quiet in a way that made some people uncomfortable. And he was not the biggest human who could have been sent. He was not the loudest or the most decorated. The selection committee back on Earth had chosen him for something that was harder to measure than size or strength. They chose him for his temperament. Danny's support team was small. Pete Harris was his cornerman and medical advisor, a 52-year-old combat medic who had served 3 tours in some of the worst conflict zones on Earth and had the gray hair and steady hands to prove it. Pete did not talk much, but when he did, people listened. Megan Price was the team's xenobiologist, a 28-year-old scientist whose job was to study every opponent species and figure out how Danny could survive against creatures that were bigger, stronger, and more heavily armed than any human. The three of them settled into the modest quarters assigned to the human delegation. It was a small set of rooms at the far end of one of the Crucible's residential wings. The Vethrak delegation had an entire floor. The Dralith had brought a support staff of over 100. The Corvani had a private training arena built to their exact specifications. Danny had a cot, a table, and Pete's medical kit. "Cozy," Pete said, dropping his bag on the floor. Megan was already setting up her data console. "The opening ceremony is in 6 hours. Every champion will be there. It is our first chance to see them up close." Danny nodded and began unpacking in silence. The opening ceremony was a grand affair held in the Crucible's central atrium, a vast domed space that could hold tens of thousands. Representatives from every species filled the observation platforms, their colors and shapes and sizes creating a living mosaic of the galaxy's diversity. The champions stood on a raised platform in the center, each one representing the best their world had to offer. Danny stood among them and looked very small. Gorath Vel, the Vethrak champion, was the largest figure on the platform. He was a scarred giant with dark green scales and 4 eyes that glowed faintly amber in the ceremonial lighting. He had won the last 2 cycles and killed more opponents in the arena than any living champion. When his gaze swept across the platform and landed on Danny, his 4 eyes narrowed with something between contempt and amusement. He did not bother to hide it. Skithvan, the Dralith champion, stood perfectly still in the way that insectoid species often did, like a statue of dark chitin and blade-sharp limbs. Her compound eyes reflected the light in 1,000 tiny facets. When she noticed Danny looking at her, her mandibles clicked together in a pattern that the translation device in Danny's ear rendered as a soft, dismissive laugh. Durin Kale, the Corvani champion, was smaller than the other 2, but moved with the coiled grace of a predator who was always 1 heartbeat away from a killing strike. His silver-gray fur was sleek and well-groomed, and his eyes were sharp with intelligence. Unlike the others, he did not dismiss Danny outright. He watched the human with a careful, measuring look, the way a hunter watches something it does not yet understand. Danny met each of their gazes without flinching. He did not posture or puff himself up. He did not try to look intimidating. He simply stood there, calm and still, a small and scarred figure from a deadly world, and let them look. After the ceremony, Megan walked beside him back to their quarters. "The Vethrak champion looked at you like you were food," she said. Danny shrugged. "He's not the first." Pete fell into step on his other side. "And the bug?" "Skithvan," Megan corrected. "The bug," Pete repeated. Danny almost smiled. "So she thinks it's funny that we're here." "Is it?" Pete asked. Danny did not answer right away. He walked in silence for a few steps, his boots quiet on the metal floor of the Crucible, surrounded by the hum and chatter of a galaxy that did not take him seriously. "Ask me again after the first fight," he said. Danny's first match was against a Felori champion named Tessari. The Felori were a feline species, tall and elegant, covered in short golden fur, with retractable claws that could slice through light armor like paper. They were known across the galaxy for their blinding speed. Tessari had competed in 2 previous cycles and had killed an opponent in each one. She was not considered a top contender for the overall title, but she was far from weak, and she had never lost a first-round match. The night before the fight, Megan sat Danny down in their small quarters and walked him through everything she had learned. The Felori were faster than humans by a wide margin, but their endurance was poor. Their bones were lightweight, built for speed instead of strength, which made them vulnerable if a fight went to the ground. Their claws were deadly at range, but their joints could hyperextend in ways that could be exploited by someone who knew how to grapple. Danny listened carefully, asked a few quiet questions about Tessari's footwork patterns from her previous fights, and then went to bed early. Pete watched him go and shook his head. "Sleeps like a baby before a fight," he muttered to Megan. "Always has. It's not natural." The arena was enormous. It was a circular pit of smooth stone surrounded by hundreds of hovering observation platforms packed with thousands of spectators from dozens of species. Floating cameras captured every angle. Commentary channels in 100 languages filled the airwaves. The rules were announced in the standard way: fight until one combatant yields, is unable to continue, or is killed. Killing was not required, but it was common and traditionally celebrated as the mark of a true champion. Tessari entered the arena like a streak of gold, light on her feet, her claws already extended. Danny walked in from the opposite side, rolling his shoulders, his expression calm and blank. The size difference was not dramatic. Tessari was slightly taller, but lighter. What was dramatic was the difference in speed. When the signal to begin sounded, Tessari moved so fast that most of the audience only saw a blur of golden fur. She opened 3 cuts across Danny's left arm in the first 10 seconds. The blood was bright and immediate. A roar went up from the crowd, a mix of excitement and anticipation. The human was bleeding. It would be over soon, but Danny did not fall. He gave ground, stepping back, keeping his guard up, letting Tessari come to him. His eyes tracked her movements with a focus that was almost mechanical. He bled freely from his arm and did not seem to notice. He was reading her, learning her rhythm, cataloging the tiny patterns in her footwork that told him where the next strike would come from. Tessari lunged for his throat. It was a killing strike, fast and precise, the kind that had ended lives in previous tournaments. Danny sidestepped at the last possible moment, caught her extended arm, and used her own speed against her. He pivoted, redirected her momentum, and then brought her down to the arena floor with a controlled throw that used technique instead of brute force. Before she could recover, he locked her arm behind her back and pressed his weight onto her shoulders, pinning her flat. The arena went quiet. Tessari thrashed beneath him. She hissed and snarled and tried to reach him with her free hand, her claws scraping against the stone floor. Danny shifted his weight and pinned that arm, too, pressing it down with his knee. He held her there with a calm, patient pressure that did not waver no matter how hard she struggled. 30 seconds passed. Tessari's struggles grew weaker. Her breathing was ragged. She was exhausted, pinned by a creature from a world with gravity half again as strong as her own, held in place by muscles that had been built to endure. This was the moment. Every champion in the history of the trials knew what came next. The victor either forced a verbal surrender or killed the pinned opponent. Their words were calm and steady, and the arena words were calm and steady, and the arena microphones picked up every one. "You fought well. I have no reason to hurt you more. Yield, and you walk out of here on your own feet." For a moment, the entire crucible held its breath. Then Tessari, trembling and gasping, yielded. Danny released her immediately. He stood up, stepped back, and offered her his hand. She stared at it. In Filori culture, a defeated warrior expected death or humiliation, not a hand up from the ground. She looked at his face and saw nothing she could read as mockery or pity. Whatever she saw there, it was enough. She took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. The arena did not cheer. It buzzed with confusion. This was not how things were done. Back in their quarters, Pete cleaned and sealed the cuts on Danny's arm while Megan monitored the reaction feeds. The commentary was not kind. Analysts called Danny's decision naive and foolish. The Vethrak delegation issued an informal statement calling the display dishonorable. Several species used words that roughly translated to soft or weak. Megan showed Danny the feeds. He read them without expression. "They think you're weak," she said. "Good," Danny said. "Then let them." Danny's second match was against a Horathian, a massive bovine creature that stood 7 feet tall and weighed over 500 pounds. It charged Danny like a living battering ram, shaking the arena floor with each step. Danny could not match it for strength, so he did not try. He used angles, footwork, and timing. He redirected each charge, letting the creature's own weight carry it past him until the Horathian's lungs were heaving and its legs were shaking. Then Danny took it to the ground with a sweep that used the creature's forward momentum against it, pinned it with a hold that locked its thick neck, and spoke to it quietly until it yielded. His third match was against a Sylphine, a 6-limbed primate species with a prehensile tail tipped with a venomous spine. The Sylphine was fast, clever, and nearly caught Danny in a chokehold with its tail. And Danny broke free at the cost of a deep puncture wound in his left thigh from the tail spine and a burst of venom that sent fire racing up his leg. He fought through the pain, caught the Sylphine's primary arm, and dislocated its shoulder with a controlled joint lock that was precise enough to disable without causing permanent damage. Then he stepped back and waited. The Sylphine, clutching its arm, looked at him with wide, confused eyes. Danny stood there, breathing hard, the blood running down his leg, and said nothing. He simply waited. The Sylphian yielded. 3 fights, 3 victories, 0 kills. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Danny took damage in every match. He bled, he bruised, he cracked a rib against the Horathian, and limped from the venom wound for days after the Sylphian fight. Pete patched him up each time with the grim efficiency of a man who had kept soldiers alive under far worse conditions. Danny never complained about the pain. He sat still while Pete worked on him, his eyes distant and focused, already thinking about the next fight. What unsettled the other champions was not that Danny won. Plenty of fighters won. What unsettled them was the combination of things they saw in him. He absorbed punishment that would have broken most species. He endured pain without visible distress, as if suffering was just another part of the job. And then, at the exact moment when he had total power over his opponent, the moment when every instinct and every tradition said to finish the kill, he chose restraint. Every single time. Gorath Vel, the Vethrak champion, found Danny in a corridor between rounds. The reptilian giant blocked the hallway with his massive frame. All 4 arms crossed over his scaled chest and looked down at the human with burning amber eyes. "You dishonor your opponents," Gorath said. "A true warrior finishes what he starts. Your mercy is an insult." Danny looked up at him. Only he had to tilt his head back to meet the Vethrak's gaze. He showed no sign of fear, no sign of tension. He stood in the shadow of a creature that could tear him in half and looked at it the way a man looks at a storm on the horizon, aware of the danger, respectful of it, but not afraid. "Where I come from," Danny said, "killing someone you've already beaten isn't strength. It's just cruelty." Gorath snarled, a deep rumbling sound that vibrated through the corridor walls, and walked away. But he looked back once over his massive shoulder. And in that brief glance, there was something that had not been there before, something that sat uncomfortably in the chest of a warrior who had never lost a fight. It was doubt. Something strange was happening in the Crucible, and Megan Price was the first to notice it. She had been tracking data on every match, every opponent, and every post-fight reaction since the tournament began. It was her job to study alien species, and to find patterns in their behavior, and what she was seeing now did not match any pattern she had studied. The opponents Danny had defeated were not behaving the way defeated champions normally behaved. In past cycles of the trials, a fighter who lost was expected to disappear. They retreated to their delegation in shame, avoided public spaces, and often left the Crucible before the tournament was over. So some species treated a loss as a mark of disgrace that followed a warrior for the rest of their life. A few treated it as something worse than death. Danny's former opponents were doing none of those things. Tesseri, the Filori champion he had beaten in the first round, had been seen at every one of Danny's subsequent matches. She sat on the observation platforms and watched with an expression that the Filori diplomatic staff could not explain. The Harathian had told its delegation that it did not feel ashamed of the loss, only confused, as if something had happened to it that it did not have the words for. And the Sylphine, whose shoulder Danny had dislocated, sent a formal message to the human delegation that the translation systems rendered as, "I do not understand your warrior, but I respect what I cannot understand." Megan compiled all of this data and brought it to Laura Kim. The human ambassador had been spending the tournament in quiet political meetings, moving between delegations with the same calm, measured approach that had earned her the posting in the first place. She listened to Megan's report in her small office, her hands folded on her desk, and a light came into her eyes that Megan recognized as the look of someone who had just found the angle they were looking for. "He's not just winning fights," Laura said. "He's breaking something. The entire structure of this tournament is built on the idea that power means destruction. Every species here believes that. It's been true for centuries. And Danny is standing in the middle of it and saying no." Laura did not boast about this to anyone. She did not make speeches or grand claims. She simply moved through the delegations, having quiet conversations, asking careful questions. "What did your people think of the match? How did the crowd react? What does your culture make of a warrior who chooses not to kill?" She planted the questions like seeds and let them grow. Meanwhile, Danny was preparing for the hardest fight of his life so far. Durin Kale, the Corvani champion, had advanced through the bracket with a cold efficiency that impressed even the Vethrak. The Corvani were pack hunters by nature, and their fighting style reflected it. They did not rely on brute strength or raw speed. They used intelligence, deception, feints, and traps. Durin was considered one of the smartest fighters in the history of the trials. He studied his opponents the way a chess player studied a board, and by the time a match began, he had already planned 3 moves ahead. But the thing that worried Megan most was the venom. Corvani claws carried a natural toxin that attacked the nervous system. In most species, a single scratch caused paralysis within seconds. In humans, the effect was different. The venom would not paralyze Danny, but it would cause intense localized pain and temporary loss of muscle control wherever it entered his blood. Even a small scratch would feel like fire and make the affected area useless for minutes. "You cannot let him scratch you," Megan told Danny during their briefing. Danny looked at the data on Durin's fighting style, the endless feints and misdirections, the way the Corvani constantly probed for openings. "That's going to be hard to avoid," he said. Pete sat in the corner, uncleaning a medical instrument. "So what else is new?" he said. The match began at midday, Crucible time, and the arena was packed. Word had spread about the human who refused to kill, and the audience had grown with each round. Species that normally did not care about the early matches were tuning in. Something was happening that the galaxy had not seen before, and everyone wanted to watch. Durin Kale entered the arena like smoke, low and quiet and fluid. His silver-gray fur was sleek against his body, and his venomous claws caught the light as he moved. His eyes never left Danny, and Danny saw in them something he had not seen in his previous opponents: genuine respect. Durin did not underestimate him. Durin had watched every fight and had done his homework. That made him the most dangerous opponent yet. The fight started fast. Durin came at Danny with a series of feints that were so convincing, Danny nearly committed to blocking strikes that never came. The real attack came from a different angle each time, a claw swipe from the left when Danny expected the right, a low slash when Danny expected high. Within the first 2 minutes, Durin had scratched Danny's right forearm. The venom hit like liquid fire. Danny felt the muscles in his forearm seize and burn, and his grip on that side weakened immediately. But he gritted his teeth and kept moving, switching his guard to compensate. Durin pressed the advantage. He was faster than Danny had expected, and he used the arena space brilliantly, circling, feinting, always staying just at the edge of Danny's reach. He landed a second scratch on Danny's left forearm, and then a deep slash across Danny's back that sent a wave of pain through his entire body. Danny's hands went numb. His vision blurred from the pain. The venom was spreading, and every movement felt like pushing through mud. The crowd was on its feet. The commentary channels were calling the match. The human was finished. It was only a matter of time. But Danny kept moving. He stopped trying to avoid the scratches and started accepting them as the cost of getting close. He pushed through the pain, the way a drowning man pushes toward the surface, not because the effort was easy, but because the alternative was worse. He closed the distance one step at a time, and the Corvani's torso locked his hands together behind Durin's back and squeezed. Then he hooked his legs around Durin's waist and took them both to the ground. Corvani ribs were strong but narrow, built for a species that relied on agility rather than bulk. Danny's legs were different. Yet they were the legs of a man who had grown up on a world where gravity pulled harder than almost anywhere else in the galaxy. Legs that had been built by millions of years of evolution to carry weight and endure strain that would cripple other species. He squeezed, and he felt Durin's ribs flexing inward. Durin went very still. He could feel the pressure on his chest, and he understood with perfect clarity that the human wrapped around him could crush his ribcage with those legs. And from the venom, his back burning from the slash wound. He looked like a man who was barely holding himself together, but his voice, when he spoke, was clear. "Yield," he said. "Please." That word carried through the arena like a bell. Please, not a command from a victor to a defeated enemy, a request. Danny Cole, bleeding and half-poisoned, and on the arena floor and tried to understand what they were witnessing. Durin Kale yielded. Danny released him and collapsed onto his back beside the Corvani, staring up at the distant ceiling of the arena, his chest heaving. Durin lay beside him, unharmed, his ribs intact. Ishan turned his head to look at the human. "Why do you hold back?" Durin asked. "You could end us all. Why do you choose not to?" Danny did not look at him. He stared at the ceiling and spoke through ragged breaths. "Because winning doesn't mean someone else has to be destroyed." Pete and Megan were beside him moments later. Pete worked fast, injecting an anti-venom compound and sealing the worst of the wounds. Megan helped lift Danny onto a stretcher as they carried him out of the arena, so the crowd watched in a silence that was heavier than any roar. It took 6 hours for the venom to flush from Danny's system. He spent most of that time unconscious in the medical bay while Pete monitored his vitals and Megan sat beside his bed, scrolling through the galaxy's reaction. The tone had shifted. Analysts were no longer calling Danny naive. Some of them were using a different word now, one that Megan had to read several times before she believed it. They were calling him terrifying. Not because of what he did, but because of what he chose not to do. A warrior who could kill and chose mercy was, to many predator species, more frightening than a warrior who simply killed. It meant a level of control and self-mastery that most of them could not imagine. In his private quarters, Gorath Vel watched the replay of Danny's fight. He watched the moment Danny said please, and he watched it again and again. His second-in-command entered and asked about strategy for the upcoming rounds. Gorath was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and heavy with something that might have been fear. "Strategy will not help us against this creature," he said. He fights like he has already accepted death, and he still chooses to let others live. The semifinals brought the tournament down to 4 fighters: Danny Cole, the human who refused to kill; Gorath Vel, the Vethrak champion who had won the last 2 cycles with overwhelming brutality; Skithvon, the Draelith champion whose exoskeleton had never been cracked and who had killed 11 opponents across 3 tournament entries; and a surprise contender named Ophira Sen, a Narathi champion, tall and willowy with pale translucent skin and the ability to generate bioelectric charges powerful enough to stop a heart. The bracket was drawn, and Danny's semi-final opponent was Skithvon. See, Megan did not sugarcoat the briefing. She stood in front of Danny and Pete in their small quarters, her data console projecting images and diagrams of Draelith anatomy, and laid out the situation in plain terms. "Skithvon is the most physically dangerous opponent you will face before the final," she said. "She stands close to 7 feet tall. Her exoskeleton is a natural armor that covers almost her entire body, and it is strong enough to deflect most bladed weapons. She has 4 limbs, each one ending in a serrated edge that functions as a natural sword. Her mandibles can crush bone. She has competed in 3 cycles and killed 11 opponents. She has never been seriously injured in the arena." Danny studied the diagrams. "Where are the weak points?" "The joints," Megan said. "The neck. And here, beneath the thorax, there is a section where the plates overlap but do not fully seal. Her compound eyes give her excellent peripheral vision, but her depth perception is poor at very close range, and her exoskeleton, while incredibly strong, limits her flexibility. She cannot twist or bend the way a human can." "So I need to get inside her reach," Danny said. "Yes. Inside her reach, her long limbs become a disadvantage, but getting there means crossing through the range where those limbs are at their most deadly. It will be like running through a field of swords." Pete was checking Danny's injuries from the previous matches, and the cracked rib had become 2 cracked ribs after the Corvani fight. The thigh wound from the Sylphine was healing, but still tender. The venom damage had left residual numbness in Danny's left hand that came and went without warning. Pete taped the ribs, tested Danny's grip strength, and sat back with a look that said everything he did not want to say out loud. "You're running out of body to break, kid," Pete said. Danny looked at him. There was a faint smile on his face, and the kind that did not reach his eyes, but was real all the same. "Then I'd better not let her break any more of it." The arena was full beyond capacity for the semi-final. Species that had been eliminated in earlier rounds had stayed at the Crucible to watch, something that almost never happened. The floating cameras were broadcasting to every corner of the Concord. On dozens of worlds, billions of beings were watching a scarred human from a death planet walk into an arena to face an armored insectoid killing machine. Skithvon was already waiting when Danny entered. She stood perfectly still in the center of the arena, her dark chitinous body gleaming under the lights, her compound eyes reflecting 1,000 tiny images of the approaching human. She did not click her mandibles this time. She did not laugh. She had watched Danny's fights carefully, and whatever she thought of his refusal to kill, she did not make the mistake of thinking he was weak. The signal sounded, and Skithvon moved first. She did not charge. She advanced in a measured, controlled series of strikes, designed to test Danny's reactions and find his weaknesses. Her serrated forelimbs swept through the air with a sound like tearing metal. Danny dodged and deflected, staying light on his feet, giving ground to buy himself time. 3 minutes into the match, Skithvon found her opening. Danny moved left when he should have moved right, and her right forelimb caught him across the chest. The serrated edge cut through his light armor as if it were cloth, and opened a long, deep gash from his left shoulder down to his right hip. Blood poured from the wound immediately, bright and shocking against his pale skin. The crowd gasped. Several species in the audience made sounds of alarm. The Vethrak delegation leaned forward with eager interest. On the commentary channels, analysts began discussing how long it would take the human to collapse from blood loss. Danny staggered. He looked down at the wound, at the blood running freely down his torso, soaking into his pants and dripping onto the arena floor. Then he looked up at Skithvon, and he stepped forward. That was the moment. The alien spectators would talk about it for years afterward, the moment they truly understood what a Deathworlder was. Not a curiosity, not a novelty, not a tough little species that had gotten lucky. A Deathworlder was a creature forged by a planet that spent 4 billion years trying to kill everything on it, a being whose entire evolutionary history was a single unbroken lesson in one thing: do not stop. Danny walked into Skithvon's reach. He moved past the arc of her serrated limbs, into the space where her length became a liability and her poor close-range depth perception left gaps in her defense. He drove his elbow into the soft spot beneath her thorax with the full force of a body that had been built by Deathworld gravity, and he felt the exoskeleton crack under the blow. Skithvon screeched. It was a sound that made nearby spectators flinch and cover their hearing organs. She swung wildly, and one of her limbs caught Danny's shoulder with a glancing blow that split the skin and sent a fresh wave of pain through his body. He did not back away. He pressed closer. He worked with the precision of a man who had studied the briefing until he could see it behind his closed eyes. Kicks to the joints of her lower limbs, each one landing in the gaps between the armor plates. Knee strikes to the same spots over and over, each impact chipping away at the chitinous plating. He was not trying to overpower her. He was disassembling her mobility one joint at a time. Skithvon's movement slowed. The gap behind it. She tried to compensate, 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 gap behind it. She tried to compensate, to adjust her stance, but her exoskeleton was rigid, and the damage was accumulating faster than she could adapt. She went down to one knee. Danny stood over her, swaying on his feet. The gash across his chest was still bleeding, and his skin had gone pale from the blood loss. His right shoulder was torn open. To willpower, and whatever stubborn thing lived in the center of a Deathworlder's brain that refused to let the body quit. He could have ended it. The cracked thorax was exposed. Her neck was within reach. Every logical calculation said he should finish her, because a wounded Dralith was still one of the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy. And leaving her conscious was a risk no sane fighter would take. Danny stepped back. He stood at a distance that gave Scythavon room. The same distance he had given every opponent, the same unspoken message. You can rise and continue if you choose, or you can yield with your dignity intact. Scythavon looked up at him with her compound eyes. In Dralith culture, this gesture, giving a downed warrior space to choose, was sacred. It was reserved for the most honored rivals within their own species. No outsider had ever offered it. No outsider had ever known to offer it. But Danny had not studied Dralith customs. Megan had never briefed him on this particular tradition. He had done it because it was who he was, because on a small patch of ground in Ohio, a boy had been raised to believe that strength without compassion was just violence, and that a man who could not show mercy to a beaten enemy was not strong at all. The arena held its breath for the second time in 2 weeks. Scythavon slowly lowered her mandibles until they nearly touched the arena floor. It was the deepest gesture of respect a Dralith warrior could make, an acknowledgement not of defeat, but of equality. She yielded, not with words, but with honor. Danny nodded to her. Then his legs gave out. He dropped to his knees, and for a moment it looked like he might stay there, balanced on the edge between consciousness and collapse. And then Pete was there, sprinting across the arena floor with a medical kit in his hands, pressing wound sealant into the gash across Danny's chest and barking orders at Megan to bring the stretcher. They carried him out while the galaxy watched, a broken and bleeding human who had just defeated one of the most feared warriors in the Concord without taking a life. In the other semi-final, Gorath Vel faced Ophira Sen. The Narathi champion was skilled and dangerous, but Gorath was a force of nature. That he absorbed her bioelectric strikes with his armored scales, closed the distance in 3 massive strides, and killed her with a single crushing blow from his upper right arm. The match lasted less than 2 minutes. When Gorath left the arena, the Vethrak delegation roared and stamped in celebration. Gorath did not acknowledge them. He walked past the cheering crowd and looked toward the corridor where Danny had been carried out, toward the medical bay, where Pete was fighting to keep the human alive. The final was set. Gorath Vel, the most powerful champion in the galaxy, against Danny Cole, a scarred and broken man from a small town on a death planet. The galaxy leaned forward and held its breath. The night before the final, Danny lay in the medical bay and stared at the ceiling. Pete had done everything he could. The gash across Danny's chest was sealed with medical adhesive and bioskin patches, but the tissue beneath was fragile and could tear open again with enough force. His 2 cracked ribs were taped tight against his torso. His left hand still went numb at random intervals, a gift from the Corvani venom that the antidotes had not fully cleared. He had lost enough blood over the course of the tournament that Pete had administered 2 transfusions from the supply they had brought from Earth, and his body was still catching up. But Megan came in late that evening with her final briefing. She pulled up a chair beside Danny's bed and opened her data console, and the holographic image of Gorath Vel filled the small room like a shadow. "He is 9 feet tall," Megan said. "His scales are thick enough to deflect most impacts. He has 4 arms, and each one is strong enough to crush a human skull. He fights by closing distance fast and overwhelming his opponents with volume. He attacks from 4 directions at once. And there is almost no angle that is safe. He has killed 23 opponents across 4 tournament cycles." She paused and looked at Danny, Her voice was steady, the way it always was during briefings, but he could see the fear she was holding behind her eyes, pressed down and controlled, but very much alive. "His scales are thinnest on the inner surfaces of his arms and at the throat," she continued. "His lower pair of eyes track slightly slower than his upper pair. So there is a tiny delay when he shifts focus downward. He favors his upper right arm for killing strikes, and he tends to overcommit when he uses it." "What does Pete say?" Danny asked. Megan did not answer right away. She glanced toward the door, as if hoping Pete would walk in and answer for himself. He did not. "He says you have about a 30% chance of surviving the match if it goes longer than 5 minutes. Danny was quiet for a long moment, and the hum of the medical equipment filled the silence. Then he said, "Tell Pete I've had worse odds." Megan looked at him. She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him that no one would blame him if he withdrew. She wanted to say that he had already done more than anyone had expected, that Earth's reputation was secure, that he did not need to die to prove a point. But she had been with Danny long enough to know that none of those things would change his mind. So she nodded, closed her console, and left him to rest. The final match drew the largest audience in the history of the Trials of Supremacy. Every observation platform in the arena was full. Every broadcast channel in the Concord was carrying the feed. On dozens of worlds, billions of beings stopped what they were doing to watch. The betting markets had Gareth Vell as the overwhelming favorite. The odds against Danny were so steep that a few human gamblers back on Earth had placed bets on him purely for the potential payout. Danny walked into the arena slowly. His movements were careful and measured, the walk of a man conserving every drop of energy for what was ahead. The gash across his chest was visible beneath his light armor, sealed but angry red, a reminder of every fight that had brought him to this moment. He looked small in the vast arena, a single human figure on a stone floor under lights bright enough to be seen from orbit. Gareth Vell entered from the opposite side, and the difference between them was almost absurd. The Vethrak champion was a wall of dark green scales and corded muscle, his 4 arms flexing at his sides, his 4 amber eyes locked onto Danny with an intensity that made the air in the arena feel heavier. Each of his footsteps sent a faint vibration through the stone floor. Gareth stopped across from Danny and spoke. His deep voice rolled through the arena like distant thunder. "Human, you have fought with skill, and I do not deny it. But your refusal to kill dishonors every opponent you have faced. In this arena, mercy is weakness. I will show you what true strength looks like." Danny looked up at him the way he had looked up at the Vethrak in that corridor weeks ago, calm, steady, and utterly without fear. "You can try," he said. The signal sounded. Gareth charged. He crossed the distance between them in 3 enormous strides, all 4 arms coming at Danny from different angles. Danny dodged the first strike, made a sweeping blow from the upper left arm that would have taken his head off, but the second strike caught him. Gareth's lower left arm connected with Danny's side, and the impact lifted him off his feet and sent him skidding across the arena floor. Danny rolled and got up. He tasted blood. His ribs screamed. Gareth was already on top of him again. The first 3 minutes were brutal. Danny could do nothing but survive. He dodged, rolled, ducked, and absorbed glancing blows that would have been killing strikes against most species. Gareth's 4 arms created overlapping patterns of attack that left almost no safe space. Every time Danny thought he found an opening, a 3rd or 4th arm was already swinging toward it. He took hits to his arms, his legs, his ribs. Each impact drove the air from his lungs and sent waves of pain through his body that he had to push down and ignore because stopping to feel them would mean dying. But Danny did not go down. This was the thing that the aliens in the audience were only beginning to understand. Humans were not the strongest species in the galaxy. They were not the fastest or the most heavily armored. But they were something else, something that had been bred into their bones by 100,000 years of evolution on a planet that did not care whether they lived or died. Humans were persistence predators. On Earth, the winning strategy had never been to outrun the prey or overpower it. The strategy was to follow it, to keep moving when the prey had to stop, to walk and jog and trudge through heat and cold and pain and exhaustion long after every other creature had collapsed, to simply refuse to stop. Danny could not match Gorath's strength. He could not match his speed or his armor. But he could outlast him. Every dodge, every roll, every glancing blow absorbed instead of a direct hit. Oh, all of it was buying time. Danny was making Gorath work for every strike, and the Vethrak was spending enormous energy with each swing of his 4 arms. By the 5-minute mark, Gorath's breathing was heavier. By 7 minutes, his strikes were a fraction slower. By 10 minutes, the champion, who had never been pushed past the 5-minute mark in any previous fight, was showing real fatigue, and Danny Cole, he held together by tape and willpower and something ancient and stubborn that lived in the marrow of Deathworld bones, was still on his feet. Danny began to counter. Small, precise strikes aimed at the thin scales on the inner surfaces of Gorath's arms, the spots Megan had identified. An elbow to the lower eyes when Gorath overextended, exploiting that tiny delay in tracking. A kick to the knee joint that made the 9-foot giant stumble for the first time in the match. None of the strikes were powerful enough to bring Gorath down on their own. But they added up. Each one chipped away at the Vethrak's armor. Each one slowed him a little more. At the 12-minute mark, Danny saw it. Gorath swung with his upper right arm, his killing arm, the one Megan said he favored, and he overcommitted. His weight shifted forward just a fraction too far, and for one heartbeat, his throat was exposed. Danny ducked under the blow, stepped inside the arc of all 4 arms, and drove his fist into Gorath's throat with everything he had left. Gorath choked. His 4 hands flew to his neck, his eyes went wide. He staggered backward, gasping, and then dropped to one knee. The arena floor shook with the impact. Danny stood in front of him. He was swaying on his feet like a tree in a storm. Blood was dripping from a dozen wounds. His right eye was swollen shut. 2 fingers on his left hand were broken. He could feel his ribs grinding against each other with every breath, and each breath was a small act of defiance against a body that was begging him to fall. He had won. Gorath was down and vulnerable. One more strike to the throat would end it. Every champion who had ever stood in this arena would have taken that strike. 40 species and 100 generations of tradition said to take that strike. Danny took a step back. He took another step back. He stood at a distance, at the same distance he had stood from every opponent, and he waited. Gorath looked up at him. The Vethrak's 4 amber eyes were wide, and the translators picked up the emotion behind them and searched for the right word. It took several seconds. The word was awe. "Why?" Gorath rasped. "You are dying on your feet. You have nothing left. Why do you not finish this?" Danny's voice was hoarse. It was barely above a whisper. But the arena microphones carried every word to every corner of the crucible and every broadcast receiver in the Concord to every world and every species that was watching. Because this is what strength looks like where I come from. Not what you can destroy, what you can choose not to destroy, even when you have every right to, even when it costs you everything. He paused. Blood dripped from his chin to the arena floor. On my world, we have a word for it. We call it mercy. And it is the hardest thing a warrior can do. The arena was silent. A complete, absolute silence that stretched across the crucible and across the stars. The kind of silence that falls when something fundamental shifts in the way people see the world. Gorath Vel lowered his head. Not a Vethrak gesture, a human one. The gesture Danny had offered every opponent he had faced. He yielded. Danny nodded. Then his eyes rolled back and he collapsed. Pete was in the arena before Danny's body hit the ground. Megan was right behind him. The medical team worked on Danny right there on the stone floor, sealing wounds and injecting stimulants and fighting to keep his heart beating while the galaxy watched in silence. Danny survived. It took 3 days in intensive care and 2 more weeks of recovery. But he survived, because that was what Deathworlders did. They survived. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy changed. Tesseri, the Filori champion, formally petitioned her government to propose an amendment to the trials that would remove any honor or advantage associated with killing a defeated opponent. The Herathian and Sylphine delegations joined her. Durin Kale, the Corvani champion, visited Danny in the medical bay. They talked for 2 hours. When Durin left, he told the waiting press that he had recommended a formal alliance between his people and Earth. Any species that produces warriors who fight like that and still choose mercy, he said, is a species we want beside us. Skithvon, the Draelith champion, sent Danny a formal invitation to visit the Draelith homeworld as an honored warrior. No outsider in the history of her species had ever received such an invitation, and Gorath Vel, who had been silent since the final match, released a single statement to the conquered press networks. It read, "I have fought and killed across 4 cycles of the trials. I believe that was strength. The human showed me that true strength is not in what you can take from the universe, but in what you choose to give back. I was not defeated. I was taught, and I am not ashamed." Laura Kim read the statement in her small office and allowed herself one quiet smile. She opened a channel to Earth and began writing her report. Humanity's first entry into the trials of supremacy had succeeded beyond anything they had planned, not because their champion won, but because of how he won. In his recovery bed, Danny slept. Pete sat beside him in a chair, reading a paperback novel he had carried all the way from Earth. Megan was at her console, already looking ahead, building files and studying data for a future that looked very different from the one anyone had expected. The galaxy was watching humanity now. Not with contempt or amusement, but with something much more valuable: respect. And in the hearts and minds of 40 alien civilizations, a new idea was taking root. A word borrowed from a death-world species that had no business surviving its own planet, let alone standing in the center of a galactic arena and teaching the stars what it meant to be strong. Mercy.